Easter morning bells of St. Mary Mead rang out across the village with their familiar bronze voices, calling the faithful to celebrate the resurrection while dew still clung to the daffodils in cottage gardens and smoke rose lazily from chimneys where Sunday roasts were already beginning their slow transformation. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her worn but well-maintained gloves as she made her way along the cobbled path to St. Bartholomew's, her sensible shoes clicking softly against stones that had witnessed countless Easter processions. The morning held that particular quality of English spring light that seemed to promise renewal while maintaining a certain reserve, as if nature itself understood the importance of not appearing too eager. Inside the ancient church, the congregation had arranged itself with the unconscious precision of a social map, each family claiming their hereditary territory among the oak pews. Miss Marple had chosen her customary seat 3 rows from the altar on the left side, a position that afforded an excellent view of both the proceedings and her fellow parishioners. From this vantage point, she observed that Mrs. Dolly Bantry wore a new hat adorned with silk violets that trembled slightly when she turned her head, and that young Timothy Ashford, Colonel Weatherby's secretary, appeared unusually pale and kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone who had not yet arrived. The Reverend Julian Hargreaves conducted the service with his usual mixture of theatrical flourish and genuine devotion, his voice rising and falling with practiced cadence as he led the congregation through the familiar Easter liturgy. Miss Marple noted with quiet interest that Mrs. Pemberton, the Colonel's longtime housekeeper, clutched her prayer book with white knuckles and seemed to start at every sound, while Mr. Alistair Ashworth, the wealthy newcomer who had recently purchased the Grange, sang the hymns with unnecessary volume, as if determined to prove his place in village society through sheer vocal force. When the service concluded, the congregation filed out into the spring sunshine for the traditional Easter gathering in the vicarage garden. Mrs. Hargreaves had arranged tables laden with seed cake and hot cross buns, while children in their Sunday best chased each other among the early roses, their laughter creating a cheerful counterpoint to the more subdued conversations of their elders. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from the vicar's wife and positioned herself near the garden wall where she could observe the various social currents that flowed through the gathering like invisible streams. She noticed that Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, striking in a pale blue dress that emphasized her auburn hair, drew admiring glances from several of the younger men while their wives watched with expressions of polite disapproval. Timothy Ashford hovered near her with the devoted attention of a moth to flame, though Mrs. Ashworth seemed more interested in her animated conversation with Dr. Haydock about the medicinal properties of certain garden herbs. Colonel Weatherby himself stood apart from the main group, his military bearing unchanged by retirement, though Miss Marple observed that his usually steady hands trembled slightly as he lit his pipe. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered when young Susan Hargreaves came running from the direction of the old summer house, her face flushed with excitement and something approaching fear. "Mummy," she called to Mrs. Hargreaves, "there's a lady sleeping in the summer house, but she won't wake up when I speak to her, and there's something red on her dress." The effect of these innocent words was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Haydock set down his teacup with a sharp clink and strode toward the summer house, followed by Colonel Weatherby and several other men. Miss Marple moved more slowly, but with equal purpose, her mild blue eyes already cataloguing the reactions of those around her. Mrs. Ashworth had gone very pale and pressed her hand to her throat, while Timothy Ashford's face had assumed an expression of barely controlled panic. In the shadowy interior of the summer house, they found Mrs. Lavinia Fullerton, the village's most dedicated gardener and keeper of the church flowers. She lay crumpled on the wooden bench where generations of vicars had taken their afternoon tea, her usually immaculate grey dress stained with what was unmistakably blood. Her gardening basket had overturned beside her, spilling lily-of-the-valley flowers across the floor like scattered pearls. Dr. Haydock knelt beside her and confirmed what they all already knew. Mrs. Fullerton was quite dead. Miss Marple's keen eyes took in several details that seemed to escape the others in their shock and confusion. A small silver thimble lay beneath the bench, its surface bearing traces of what appeared to be a dark, sticky substance. More intriguingly, she noticed that Mrs. Fullerton's prized lily-of-the-valley flowers, which she guarded so jealously in her cottage garden, were scattered not randomly, but in a deliberate pattern, as if someone had arranged them with careful intent. The morning's promise of renewal had transformed into something far darker, and Miss Marple found herself once again confronting the eternal puzzle of human nature and its capacity for both creation and destruction. The news of Mrs. Fullerton's death rippled through the Easter gathering like a stone cast into still water, each concentric circle of whispered revelation carrying fresh shock and speculation. Within moments, the cheerful chatter had transformed into hushed conferences among the flower beds, while children sensed the adult tension and drew closer to their parents with that instinctive awareness that something terrible had occurred. Dr. Haydock emerged from the summer house with his professional composure intact but his face grave, immediately assuming the natural authority that comes from years of dealing with village crises, both medical and social. Mrs. Hargreaves, displaying the practical efficiency that made her such an effective vicar's wife, quickly organized the dispersal of guests while ensuring that no one left the premises until proper authorities could be summoned. Her husband struggled with the theological implications of death on Easter morning, muttering prayers under his breath, while his hands shook as he attempted to comfort the more distressed members of his congregation. Miss Marple observed with interest that grief and shock affected different people in remarkably different ways, and she filed away mental notes about who seemed genuinely surprised and who appeared to be performing shock for the benefit of others. The village constable, P.C. Jenkins, arrived within 20 minutes, his bicycle clattering against the vicarage gate as he dismounted with more haste than grace. A well-meaning man whose experience with serious crime was limited to the occasional poached pheasant or domestic dispute, he approached the situation with a mixture of determination and barely concealed anxiety. Miss Marple watched as he began questioning the assembled villagers, noting that his technique, while thorough, lacked the subtle understanding of human nature that such situations required. The theories began almost immediately, each more elaborate than the last. Mrs. Bantry, never one to remain silent when drama presented itself, declared it must be the work of some passing tramp who had seen Mrs. Fullerton as an easy target. "These wandering types," she proclaimed with the satisfaction of someone identifying a significant clue. "They see a lone woman with her gardening basket and think she might have valuables hidden away." This explanation found ready acceptance among several villagers, offering as it did the comfort of believing evil had originated from beyond their familiar boundaries. Mr. Ashworth, the newcomer who owned the grange, offered his observations with the careful precision of someone eager to demonstrate his integration into local society. He mentioned seeing Mrs. Fullerton in animated conversation with someone near the church gate several evenings ago, though the twilight had been too dim for him to identify her companion. His wife, Vivian, still unnaturally pale, added that Mrs. Fullerton had recently shown unusual interest in the medicinal properties of certain plants, asking specific questions about which flowers might be dangerous if consumed improperly. Timothy Ashford, when pressed by P.C. Jenkins, admitted with obvious reluctance that he had encountered Mrs. Fullerton the previous afternoon while walking near the church. She had been carrying her gardening basket and seemed agitated, refusing his offer of assistance and hurrying away without her usual polite conversation. His account was delivered in a nervous, stammering manner that suggested either natural shyness or something more troubling, and Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Ashworth watched him with an expression that seemed to extend beyond mere neighborly concern. Colonel Weatherby, his military bearing unchanged by the circumstances, offered a more measured assessment. Foul play, undoubtedly, but who would want to harm Lavinia Fullerton? She was a quiet woman, kept to herself mostly, rather particular about her flowers, perhaps, but hardly the sort to make enemies. He paused, puffing thoughtfully on his pipe. Unless it was something from her past. One never truly knows what people bring with them when they settle in a village. His words carried a subtle insinuation that caught the attention of several older residents who exchanged meaningful glances. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had conducted a preliminary examination and reported his findings to P.C. Jenkins in low, professional tones. While he could not make definitive statements without proper autopsy, his initial assessment suggested poisoning of some kind, with the blood on Mrs. Fullerton's dress appearing to have come from her mouth and nose. He estimated death had occurred in the early morning hours, raising immediate questions about what she had been doing in the summer house at such an unusual time. Miss Marple listened to these various accounts with the patient attention of someone accustomed to separating wheat from chaff in human testimony. She had positioned herself near the garden wall where she could observe without attracting attention, her mild blue eyes cataloguing reactions and noting inconsistencies. The lily-of-the-valley flowers scattered around the body were not the common varieties that grew wild locally, but rather the exotic specimens Mrs. Fullerton cultivated in her private garden with such jealous care. More intriguingly, that small silver thimble beneath the bench bore traces of some dark substance that was neither quite blood nor quite plant sap. Mrs. Pemberton, the Colonel's housekeeper, stood apart from the main group, clutching her apron with white knuckles and wearing an expression that suggested she knew more than she was prepared to share. When asked directly about Mrs. Fullerton's recent behavior, she merely muttered something about people who didn't trust those who let ivy climb unchecked, because ivy had a way of getting under tiles when nobody was looking. As the afternoon wore on and official procedures began in earnest, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Mrs. Fullerton's death was far from the random tragedy it might initially appear. The careful arrangement of those precious flowers, the unusual location, and the various behavioral oddities reported by neighbors all pointed to a crime planned with considerable thought and attention to detail. Someone in their peaceful village had committed murder, and the Easter morning revelation was only the beginning of what promised to be a much more complex and disturbing story. The arrival of Inspector Slack from the county constabulary brought an immediate shift in atmosphere to the vicarage garden, his brisk efficiency and urban skepticism cutting through the village's more measured pace of inquiry like a sharp blade through silk. A square-built man with a square chin and equally angular opinions, Slack surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of someone who preferred his crime straightforward and his witnesses cooperative. He took immediate control from P.C. Jenkins, whose relief was poorly disguised, and began organizing the investigation with military precision that brooked no interference from well-meaning villagers or their theories about wandering strangers. Miss Marple positioned herself on a weathered bench beneath the ancient oak tree, from which vantage point she could observe the proceedings without attracting official attention. She watched as Inspector Slack's penetrating gaze settled with obvious interest on Timothy Ashford, whose nervous stammering and pale complexion made him appear guilty of something, though whether murder remained to be determined. The inspector's questions were direct and uncompromising, designed to establish facts rather than explore the subtle web of relationships that Miss Marple suspected lay beneath this crime's surface. Under Slack's relentless questioning, Timothy's account of his encounter with Mrs. Fullerton became increasingly fragmented and contradictory. He admitted to meeting her near the church the previous afternoon, acknowledged that she had seemed agitated, and refused his offer of assistance, but claimed their interaction had been brief and inconsequential. When pressed about his Easter morning whereabouts, he stammered that he had been in his room at Colonel Weatherby's house, preparing for service, a plausible but uncorroborated alibi that did nothing to ease the inspector's suspicions. Mrs. Ashworth's protective glances toward the young secretary took on new significance, suggesting either innocent concern or shared knowledge of something more troubling. Inspector Slack's theory crystallized quickly around the obvious suspect. Timothy Ashford had means, having access to the Colonel's extensive grounds where various plants grew. Opportunity, living nearby with no solid alibi, and potential motive, though this remained frustratingly vague. Perhaps Mrs. Fullerton had discovered some impropriety in his work, or witnessed behavior that could cost him his position. The inspector's satisfaction with this neat solution was evident as he prepared to make an arrest, confident that swift action would reassure the village and close an unpleasant chapter. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly skeptical of the obvious conclusion. While Timothy's nervousness was undeniable, it struck her as the transparent anxiety of youth under pressure rather than the calculated fear of a murderer. She had observed genuine killers before, and they possessed a different quality entirely, a watchful stillness that Timothy's obvious distress seemed to contradict. Moreover, the careful arrangement of those precious lily-of-the-valley flowers around Mrs. Fullerton's body suggested an intimate knowledge of her passions and a symbolic gesture that seemed beyond Timothy's rather unrefined sensibilities. Excusing herself from the official proceedings with the gentle insistence that came naturally to elderly ladies concerned about practical matters, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Fullerton's cottage, ostensibly to assess the situation regarding the church flowers that would now lack their devoted keeper. The cottage stood behind its protective wall of bottle glass, neat and self-contained as its late owner had been. Inside, the rooms revealed the methodical nature of someone who had lived alone for many years, every object in its designated place, every surface bearing the patina of careful maintenance. In the scullery, Miss Marple discovered a row of carefully labeled jars containing various dried herbs and plant materials. One jar, marked foxglove leaves in Mrs. Fullerton's precise handwriting, stood conspicuously empty. More intriguingly, when Miss Marple gently lifted the edge of the label, she found beneath it an older marking that read, "Dried thyme," in faded ink. The implications were troubling. Someone had deliberately mislabeled a container that once held a relatively harmless herb to suggest it had contained one of nature's most potent poisons. On the mantelpiece sat a silver thimble, twin to the one found in the summer house, bearing traces of a dark, sticky substance that carried the faint odor of shoe polish mixed with something more sinister. Miss Marple's experienced eye noted the professional quality of the Colonel's always immaculate boots and Mrs. Pemberton's military-standard housekeeping. In the wastepaper basket, she discovered fragments of a partially burned note in Mrs. Fullerton's handwriting, with only the words "Mercy" and "After Easter" clearly visible among the charred remains. Dr. Heidock's preliminary examination confirmed plant poisoning, specifically from lily-of-the-valley extract, though the concentration suggested careful preparation rather than accidental ingestion. The timing remained puzzling. What had drawn Mrs. Fullerton to the summer house in the pre-dawn hours of Easter morning? Miss Marple recalled young Susan Hargreaves' account of seeing mysterious meetings near the church in recent weeks. Conversations conducted in shadows between figures who clearly wished to avoid observation. As Inspector Slack prepared his case against Timothy Ashford, Miss Marple found herself convinced that the truth lay buried much deeper in the village's carefully maintained facade of respectability, waiting for someone with patience and understanding to recognize the patterns that connected past sins with present consequences. Inspector Slack's satisfaction with his case against Timothy Ashford was evident in every gesture as he prepared the necessary paperwork for an arrest, his square jaw set with the determination of a man who prided himself on swift resolution of criminal matters. The young secretary's obvious distress, combined with his lack of a solid alibi and his admitted encounter with the deceased, created what Slack considered compelling evidence of guilt. Timothy himself seemed to shrink further into his collar with each passing hour, his protests carrying the desperate quality of someone who realizes that truth and appearance do not always align in the eyes of the law. Miss Marple, however, had begun to notice patterns that escaped the inspector's more linear approach to investigation. While Timothy's nervousness was undeniable, she observed that his anxiety seemed focused not on self-preservation, but on protecting someone else. His glances toward Mrs. Ashworth carried a quality of desperate concern that suggested his fears extended beyond his own fate. When questioned about his relationship with the attractive newcomer, Timothy's stammering became more pronounced, though Miss Marple detected notes of gallant protection rather than guilty concealment in his obvious discomfort. The revelation that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Young Susan Hargreaves, the vicar's daughter who had discovered the body, approached Miss Marple with the particular confidence that children reserve for adults they instinctively trust. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I saw Mrs. Fullerton talking to someone in the churchyard 3 nights ago, but it wasn't Mr. Timothy. It was a lady with red hair wearing a dark cloak, and they seemed to be arguing about something near the old grave." This intelligence cast an entirely different light on recent events, particularly when Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Ashworth's auburn hair and her animated discussion with Dr. Haydock about medicinal plants during the Easter gathering. The timing of this clandestine meeting, occurring just days before Mrs. Fullerton's death, suggested premeditation rather than the spontaneous violence that Inspector Slack's theory required. Further investigation revealed that Mrs. Ashworth's interest in botanical matters extended beyond casual curiosity. Dr. Haydock, when approached with Miss Marple's characteristic blend of gentle persistence and apparent innocence, admitted that Mrs. Ashworth had asked surprisingly specific questions about plant toxins and their effects on the human system. She had claimed to be researching a novel, a common enough explanation that had satisfied the doctor initially, though he now wondered if her inquiries had been motivated by more practical considerations. The discovery of Mrs. Fullerton's partially burned note took on new significance when Miss Marple realized that the word mercy might not refer to divine compassion, but to someone's name. Mrs. Pemberton, when gently questioned about village history, revealed that Vivian Ashworth had been known as Mercy during her youth in a neighboring county, a pet name derived from her middle name, Mercedes. This connection, combined with evidence of their secret meeting, suggested that Mrs. Fullerton and Mrs. Ashworth shared some history that had followed them both to St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack remained unconvinced by these developments, viewing them as village gossip that complicated straightforward cases. His experience had taught him that the obvious suspect was usually correct, and Timothy's nervous behavior continued to satisfy his professional instincts. He dismissed Miss Marple's observations as well-meaning interference from an elderly lady whose detective novels had given her unrealistic ideas about criminal investigation. The village itself quickly began to digest the inspector's implied accusations. Mrs. Bantry found Timothy's guilt entirely believable, declaring to anyone who would listen that quiet young men were always the most dangerous. Others were more reluctant to condemn, particularly Mrs. Ashworth, who spoke passionately in Timothy's defense, insisting he was incapable of such brutality. Her desperate advocacy only deepened Miss Marple's quiet suspicions about their true relationship. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the clues she had quietly gathered. The mislabeled jar in Mrs. Fullerton's scullery, where dried thyme had been overwritten with foxglove leaves, suggested deliberate deception requiring intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. The twin silver thimbles, one ornamental and one practical, both bearing traces of the same dark substance, spoke of careful preparation rather than hasty violence. These details seemed beyond Timothy's capabilities and suggested a more sophisticated mind at work. The fragments of the burned note continued to haunt her thoughts. Mercy and after Easter implied some ongoing negotiation or plea, suggesting a relationship with deeper roots than a chance encounter. Such correspondence indicated premeditation and emotional complexity that contradicted the image of Timothy as an impulsive killer driven by immediate desperation. As Inspector Slack confidently prepared to remove Timothy for further questioning, Miss Marple observed the subtle reactions of the assembled villagers. Mrs. Pemberton watched with an intensity that suggested protected knowledge, while Dr. Haydock appeared unusually preoccupied, as if wrestling with implications that extended beyond his medical findings. These were not the reactions of people convinced that justice was being served. Miss Marple nodded politely as the inspector explained his case, her mild blue eyes betraying none of the quiet certainty growing within her. The threads of this particular mystery were woven far more intricately into the fabric of village life than Slack's straightforward narrative allowed, and Timothy Ashford, she felt certain, was merely one thread rather than the knot itself. While Inspector Slack proceeded with his methodical interrogation of Timothy Ashford, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the summer house where Mrs. Fullerton had met her end. The official investigation had focused on the obvious elements: the body, the scattered flowers, the apparent signs of poisoning. But Miss Marple's experience had taught her that murderers, however careful, invariably left traces of themselves in the smallest details. With the gentle persistence that had served her well in previous investigations, she obtained permission to collect some personal effects that might comfort the bereaved, though her true purpose was far more systematic. Her first discovery came while examining the rough wooden bench where Mrs. Fullerton had been found. Caught in a splinter near the victim's head was a single strand of pale blue silk thread, so fine it might have been overlooked entirely by less observant eyes. The thread bore a tiny, deliberate knot of the sort used in decorative needlework, far too sophisticated for any practical purpose. Miss Marple carefully extracted it with a needle from her reticule, recognizing immediately the quality of silk and the precise craftsmanship of the knot. She recalled seeing identical thread at the Grange, where Mrs. Ashworth had used it to tie napkins with the same distinctive sailor's knots that had drawn admiring comments from dinner guests. More intriguingly, when Miss Marple examined the floorboards beneath where Mrs. Fullerton's head had rested, she discovered something that made her pause with sudden understanding. Scratched into the soft wood, almost invisible beneath a fine layer of dust, was a tiny letter M, carved with delicate precision. The mark was fresh, made by something small and sharp, pressed repeatedly into the grain. When she compared the pattern to the ornate edge of the silver thimble found beneath the bench, the match was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately carved this initial, using the thimble as an impromptu engraving tool. A visit to Mrs. Fullerton's cottage revealed further evidence of careful planning. In the garden behind the house, Miss Marple's trained eye detected signs of recent disturbance in the prized lily-of-the-valley bed. The soil showed clear evidence of excavation and hasty replacement, with traces of reddish clay mixed among the carefully maintained earth. A clay type foreign to Mrs. Fullerton's meticulously prepared garden beds. Scattered among the disturbed earth were fragments of what appeared to be photographs, so thoroughly degraded by recent rain that their original subjects were barely discernible. One fragment showed part of a woman's hand wearing a distinctive ring, while another revealed the edge of what might have been a military uniform. These photographic remnants suggested a motive far more complex than Inspector Slack's theory allowed. Mrs. Fullerton, it seemed, had been in possession of compromising materials that someone desperately needed to recover. The careful burial and subsequent frantic excavation indicated that blackmail, rather than random violence, lay at the heart of this crime. The timing of her death, occurring just as these materials were being sought, pointed to premeditation rather than the spontaneous act that Timothy's supposed guilt required. Miss Marple's attention returned to the lily-of-the-valley flowers scattered around Mrs. Fullerton's body. These were not the common varieties that grew wild in local woodlands, but rather the rare pink specimens that Mrs. Fullerton cultivated with obsessive care in her private garden. The flowers had been arranged in a deliberate pattern around the victim, forming a loose crescent that spoke of artistic sensibility rather than hasty disposal. Such intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fullerton's horticultural passions, combined with the skill to arrange them symbolically, suggested a killer who knew the victim well and possessed both botanical knowledge and aesthetic sensibility. The role of Mrs. Ashworth in these events became increasingly clear as Miss Marple pieced together the evidence. The blue silk thread, the carved initial M that could stand for her former name Mercy, her demonstrated knowledge of plant toxins, and her obvious distress all pointed toward involvement that extended far beyond neighborly concern. Timothy's protective glances and desperate attempts to shield her from questioning revealed a young man caught between loyalty and truth, his nervous behavior stemming from knowledge of her guilt rather than his own. Mrs. Pemberton's cryptic remarks about ivy getting under tiles when nobody was looking took on new significance when viewed as commentary on secrets that had gradually worked their way into the foundation of village respectability. Her access to the Colonel's household, her knowledge of local routines, and her obvious distress suggested she might have been unwittingly involved in providing opportunities or materials that the real killer had exploited. The mislabeled jar in Mrs. Fullerton's scullery, where dried thyme had been overwritten with foxglove leaves, appeared designed to suggest that the victim had been preparing poisons herself, perhaps as part of an elaborate suicide meant to implicate others. Such sophisticated deception required not only intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fullerton's habits, but also the calculating intelligence to plan several moves ahead, anticipating how investigators would interpret the evidence. As Inspector Slack prepared to formalize charges against Timothy Ashford, Miss Marple found herself entirely convinced of the young man's innocence. The true killer possessed intimate knowledge of village life, access to multiple locations, and the sophisticated understanding of both human nature and botanical science necessary to create such an elaborate deception. The scattered physical evidence, the silk thread, the carved initial, the disturbed garden, the photographic fragments, all pointed to someone who moved freely within their community, while harboring deadly secrets that Mrs. Fullerton had discovered and threatened to expose. The arrest of Timothy Ashford sent ripples of unease through St. Mary Mead, transforming the village's Easter morning tragedy into something far more personal and disturbing. While Inspector Slack proceeded with confident efficiency, preparing his case against the nervous young secretary, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the obvious solution masked a far more complex truth. The careful arrangement of evidence, the sophisticated planning required, and the intimate knowledge of village life all pointed to a killer who moved freely among them, hiding behind a facade of respectability that had taken years to construct. Her first systematic visit was to the Grange, where she found Mrs. Ashworth in a state of barely controlled agitation that seemed to extend far beyond neighborly concern for Timothy's plight. The drawing room bore signs of hasty rearrangement, as if someone had been searching for or hiding something important. Miss Marple accepted tea with her customary graciousness, noting immediately the pale blue silk threads used to tie the napkins in precise sailor's knots, the same distinctive craftsmanship she had observed in the thread found at the crime scene. Mrs. Ashworth's hands trembled slightly as she poured, and when Miss Marple mentioned casually that Mercy had been such a popular name in their generation, the teacup rattled against its saucer with unmistakable nervousness. Mr. Ashworth's hearty attempts to maintain normal conversation only emphasized the tension in the room. When Timothy arrived with a note from Colonel Weatherby, Miss Marple observed the complex interplay of glances that passed between the three. Timothy's obvious devotion to Mrs. Ashworth was matched by her protective concern for him, while Mr. Ashworth watched both with the wary attention of someone who suspected more than he was prepared to acknowledge. The note itself was innocuous, a request for assistance with church charity lists, but the elaborate casualness with which it was delivered suggested careful choreography rather than spontaneous communication. From the Grange, Miss Marple proceeded to Colonel Weatherby's residence, where the military precision of the household routine provided stark contrast to the emotional undercurrents she had just witnessed. Mrs. Pemberton received her with a formal courtesy that barely concealed deep agitation. her usual composure replaced by nervous efficiency that spoke of secrets weighing heavily on her conscience. The housekeeper's intimate knowledge of household routines, her access to all areas of the property, and her obvious distress about recent events made her a figure of increasing interest to Miss Marple's analytical mind. Colonel Weatherby himself appeared genuinely shaken by recent events, his military bearing intact, but his hands trembling more than usual as he lit his pipe. When Miss Marple mentioned Mrs. Fullerton's recent interest in old photographs, particularly those from his military service, his reaction was immediate and telling. He admitted that Mrs. Fullerton had been helping him organize family memorabilia, spending considerable time examining albums from his service years with unusual intensity. She had shown particular interest in photographs featuring his younger brother, a promising officer who had died under tragic circumstances many years earlier. This revelation connected immediately with the photographic fragments Miss Marple had discovered in Mrs. Fullerton's disturbed garden. The image of a military uniform, the distinctive seed-pearl ring that matched the one Mrs. Ashworth wore, the careful burial and subsequent frantic excavation, all suggested that Mrs. Fullerton had uncovered evidence of some long-buried scandal that multiple parties were desperate to keep hidden. The timing of her death, occurring just as these materials were being sought, indicated premeditation rather than the spontaneous violence that Inspector Slack's theory required. Mrs. Pemberton's behavior during this visit proved particularly revealing. Her usual military standard efficiency was replaced by nervous fidgeting, and she dropped several pointed hints about people who let secrets creep under foundations like ivy under tiles. When pressed gently about recent household routines, she admitted to finding evidence of unauthorized early morning visits, with traces of red clay tracked through areas where such soil should not naturally occur. Her intimate knowledge of the Colonel's boot polish collection, combined with the dark residue found on both silver thimbles, suggested access to materials that could have been used in the crime's preparation. The pattern of evidence was becoming clear to Miss Marple's experienced eye. The killer possessed detailed knowledge of multiple households, access to various locations at unusual hours, and the sophisticated understanding necessary to create an elaborate deception that would implicate others while protecting themselves. The careful arrangement of Mrs. Fullerton's precious lily-of-the-valley flowers around her body spoke of someone who knew her passions intimately, while the carved letter M in the summer-house floor suggested a deliberate signature that the killer wanted to be discovered eventually. Most significantly, the mislabeled jar in Mrs. Fullerton's scullery, where dried thyme had been overwritten with foxglove leaves, represented the kind of sophisticated planning that required intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and access to her private spaces. Such deception was designed to suggest that Mrs. Fullerton had been preparing poisons herself, perhaps as part of an elaborate suicide meant to implicate others or to mislead investigators about the true source of the fatal dose. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his case against Timothy Ashford, Miss Marple found herself entirely convinced of the young man's innocence. The true killer moved freely within their community, possessed intimate knowledge of village relationships and household routines, and had spent considerable time planning a crime that would settle old scores while deflecting suspicion onto convenient scapegoats. The scattered physical evidence, the silk thread with its distinctive knots, the photographic fragments, the disturbed garden, the mislabeled containers, all pointed to someone whose position in village society provided both opportunity and camouflage for their deadly intentions. The revelation of the killer's identity would require careful maneuvering, as Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when finally exposed, would shake the very foundations of their seemingly peaceful community. The break-in at Mrs. Fullerton's cottage occurred on the second night after her murder, discovered when Mrs. Bantry noticed unusual lights moving behind the drawn curtains and had the presence of mind to telephone both Miss Marple and P.C. Jenkins. The cottage, which had been sealed as a crime scene, showed clear signs of hasty but systematic searching, with particular attention paid to the writing desk and the collection of photograph albums that Mrs. Fullerton had maintained with characteristic precision. The intruder had been interrupted in their work, leaving behind scattered papers and the acrid smell of partially burned documents in the fireplace, where several envelopes had been hastily committed to flames that the evening's dampness had mercifully extinguished before their contents were completely destroyed. Miss Marple arrived to find P.C. Jenkins standing uncertainly in the disordered parlor, his lantern casting wavering shadows across overturned drawers and rifled shelves. Her experienced eye immediately noted that this was not the random destruction of a common burglar seeking valuables, but the focused search of someone looking for specific items. The photograph albums had been particularly targeted, with several pages torn out and others showing signs of careful removal where images had been precisely excised with a sharp blade. In the cold ashes of the fireplace, she discovered fragments that had escaped complete destruction, including the corner of what appeared to be a military photograph bearing traces of the distinctive red clay that had become an increasingly significant element in her investigation. The photographic fragments, when carefully examined by candlelight, revealed tantalizing glimpses of the past that someone had been desperate to erase. One piece showed the edge of a military uniform with distinctive regimental insignia, while another displayed a woman's hand wearing a ring set with seed pearls in a pattern that Miss Marple recognized immediately as identical to the one Mrs. Ashworth wore with such obvious pride. Most significantly, the background of these images showed the characteristic reddish clay, formations found in certain parts of the neighboring county, clay that had been appearing as trace evidence throughout her investigation in locations where it had no natural business being present. Mrs. Pemberton's behavior during the discovery of the break-in proved particularly revealing to Miss Marple's observant eye. The housekeeper arrived at the cottage within minutes of the alarm being raised, claiming to have seen suspicious figures from her bedroom window at Colonel Weatherby's house. Her intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fullerton's habits and possessions became apparent as she moved through the disordered rooms, immediately identifying which items were missing and which had been disturbed. More intriguingly, she seemed to know exactly where Mrs. Fullerton had kept her most private correspondence, directing P.C. Jenkins to a hidden compartment behind the kitchen dresser that even the intruder had failed to locate. The contents of this hidden compartment provided crucial insights into Mrs. Fullerton's final weeks. Among the carefully preserved letters was correspondence with someone identified only as M.W.'s, discussing old debts that must be settled before Easter morning brings its revelations. The handwriting was precise and educated, bearing the distinctive characteristics of someone trained in military correspondence, while the paper bore the watermark of expensive stationery that suggested a writer of considerable social standing. Most significantly, several letters referred to photographic evidence of events that had occurred 30 years earlier. Events that could destroy reputations and reveal truths that some parties would kill to keep buried. Dr. Haydock, when consulted about Mrs. Fullerton's recent state of mind, revealed that she had been increasingly agitated in the weeks before her death, speaking of ghosts from the past and expressing concern about someone in the village whose true identity had recently become clear to her. The doctor's medical records showed that Mrs. Fullerton had requested information about various plant toxins, claiming to be concerned about accidental poisoning from her extensive garden. However, her questions had been surprisingly specific, focusing on lily-of-the-valley extract and its effects when concentrated through particular preparation methods that suggested knowledge far beyond casual gardening interest. The pattern of evidence was beginning to form a clear picture in Miss Marple's analytical mind. The systematic removal of photographic evidence, the careful preparation of plant toxins, and the intimate knowledge of village routines all pointed to someone who had been planning Mrs. Fullerton's death for considerable time. The killer possessed detailed knowledge of multiple households, access to various locations at unusual hours, and the sophisticated understanding necessary to create evidence that would implicate others while protecting themselves. The red clay trail, appearing in locations connected to Colonel Weatherby's household, Mrs. Ashworth's activities, and now the crime scenes themselves, suggested someone whose movements between these locations had become routine enough to leave such distinctive traces. Mrs. Pemberton's role in these events became increasingly suspicious as Miss Marple observed her reactions to each new revelation. The housekeeper's distress seemed focused less on grief for the deceased than on anxiety about her own position, and her intimate knowledge of household schedules and routines provided exactly the access that the killer would have required. Her references to ivy getting under tiles when nobody was looking took on new significance when viewed as commentary on secrets that had gradually worked their way into the foundation of village respectability, secrets that Mrs. Fullerton had discovered and threatened to expose. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple found herself convinced that the solution lay not in present circumstances, but in events that had occurred decades earlier, events that connected Mrs. Fullerton's murder to a web of relationships and betrayals that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of village life. The killer was not seeking random victims, but settling specific accounts with people whose knowledge threatened their carefully constructed respectability. The break-in at the cottage represented a desperate attempt to erase the final evidence of past crimes. But Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Fullerton, with her methodical nature, had been too careful to leave all her secrets in one location. The truth, when finally revealed, would require understanding not just the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of someone whose entire adult life had been built on concealing events that were finally demanding their terrible reckoning. The morning after the cottage break-in brought an unexpected gathering at the vicarage where Mrs. Hargreaves had organized a small tea to discuss the church flower arrangements that would now require new management in Mrs. Fullerton's absence. Miss Marple accepted the invitation with quiet interest, recognizing that grief often loosened tongues in ways that formal questioning could not achieve. The assembled company included Mrs. Ashworth, who had volunteered her services with touching generosity, Mrs. Pemberton, whose intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fullerton's methods made her invaluable, and Colonel Weatherby, whose presence lent an air of protective authority to the proceedings. As tea was served in the familiar ritual that had comforted English villages for centuries, Miss Marple observed the subtle interactions that revealed far more than words. Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cups, her usual military precision replaced by nervous energy that suggested knowledge weighing heavily on her conscience. Mrs. Ashworth spoke with animated enthusiasm about continuing Mrs. Fullerton's work, but her fingers worried constantly at the seed pearl ring that had become such a significant element in Miss Marple's investigation. The conversation turned naturally to Mrs. Fullerton's final weeks, during which several villagers had noticed her unusual preoccupation with old photographs and historical records. Colonel Weatherby mentioned, with obvious reluctance, that she had been helping him organize family memorabilia, spending considerable time examining albums from his military service with what had seemed like innocent curiosity but now appeared more purposeful. Mrs. Pemberton added that Mrs. Fullerton had asked pointed questions about the Colonel's younger brother, whose tragic death during the war had always been a source of family sorrow. Miss Marple's attention sharpened when Mrs. Ashworth volunteered information about her own family history, claiming that her first husband had been killed in military service and buried in the local cemetery. The story was delivered with practiced smoothness, but Miss Marple noted subtle inconsistencies in dates and locations that suggested careful rehearsal rather than genuine memory. More significantly, when Colonel Weatherby mentioned his brother Marcus, Mrs. Ashworth's reaction was immediate and telling. A brief flash of recognition quickly suppressed, followed by an elaborate show of polite interest that fooled no one paying close attention. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Pemberton, perhaps seeking to unburden herself of knowledge that had become too heavy to bear alone, revealed that Mrs. Fullerton had discovered correspondence hidden in the church archives. Letters dating back 30 years, written in a precise hand and signed with the initials M.W.s, had been found tucked inside old parish registers where they had remained undisturbed for decades. The letters spoke of debts that must be settled and truths that Easter morning would reveal, suggesting that Mrs. Fullerton had been planning some form of public disclosure. Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed that these letters had been accompanied by photographic evidence that someone had been desperate to retrieve. The break-in at Mrs. Fullerton's cottage now made perfect sense. The killer had been searching for materials that could expose secrets buried for 30 years. Mrs. Pemberton's description of the photographs, showing military personnel at a base characterized by distinctive red clay formations, connected immediately with the trace evidence that had puzzled investigators throughout the case. The most significant revelation came when Colonel Weatherby, prompted by Miss Marple's tactful inquiries, admitted that his brother Marcus had not died alone. A young woman named Mercedes Wilton, who had been visiting the base as part of auxiliary services, had been present during the incident that claimed Marcus's life. The official investigation had ruled his death accidental, but family letters had suggested a more complex situation involving personal relationships and military discipline that had been hastily covered up to protect reputations. Mrs. Ashworth's growing agitation during this conversation did not escape Miss Marple's notice. When the colonel described Mercedes Wilton as a striking young woman with auburn hair who had worn a distinctive seed-pearl ring, Mrs. Ashworth's hand moved instinctively to her own jewelry, confirming suspicions that had been building throughout the investigation. The red clay that had appeared in various locations connected to the crime scenes now revealed its significance. It was distinctive to the military base where Marcus Weatherby had died and where Mercedes Wilton had last been officially recorded. Mrs. Pemberton's final contribution to the afternoon's revelations was perhaps the most damning. She admitted that Mrs. Fullerton had shown her a photograph clearly depicting Mercedes Wilton standing beside Marcus Weatherby, both in military dress, with the young woman's face bearing unmistakable resemblance to someone currently living in St. Mary Mead under an entirely different identity. The implications were staggering. Mrs. Ashworth was not who she claimed to be, but rather someone who had disappeared from official records 30 years earlier and rebuilt her entire life on a foundation of deception. As the tea gathering concluded, Miss Marple found herself in possession of the final pieces needed to solve Mrs. Fullerton's murder. The victim had discovered that Mercedes Wilton, presumed dead or disappeared, was living among them as Vivian Ashworth, married to a respectable newcomer and accepted into village society despite her fabricated past. Mrs. Fullerton's methodical investigation had uncovered not only this deception, but evidence connecting Mercedes to Marcus Weatherby's suspicious death, creating a motive for murder that extended far beyond simple concealment of identity. The killer had acted with desperate calculation, using intimate knowledge of village routines and Mrs. Fullerton's habits to stage a crime that would eliminate the threat to her carefully constructed life. The scattered lily-of-the-valley flowers, the carved initial in the summer house floor, and the mislabeled poison jar all represented attempts to create false narratives while destroying evidence of her true identity. Miss Marple now understood that she was dealing with someone whose entire adult existence had been built on concealing a 30-year-old crime, and who would kill again if necessary to protect that secret. Miss Marple's final test required the delicate orchestration that comes only from decades of observing human nature under pressure. Recognizing that confronting a clever killer demanded not dramatic accusation, but rather the creation of circumstances where guilt would reveal itself through instinctive reactions that no amount of preparation could entirely suppress. She arranged what appeared to be a memorial gathering in the vicarage summer house, ostensibly to create a fitting tribute to Mrs. Fullerton's memory, but actually designed to present Mrs. Ashworth with a carefully constructed psychological trap that would force her to demonstrate knowledge and behaviors that only the killer could possess. The assembled company included Colonel Weatherby, whose military bearing could not entirely conceal his growing distress as the investigation had progressed, Mrs. Pemberton, whose obvious anxiety suggested knowledge that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure, and Timothy Ashford, recently released from custody but still bearing the haunted expression of someone who had glimpsed the gallows through no fault of his own. Mrs. Ashworth herself arrived precisely on time, outwardly composed but betraying subtle signs of tension in the way her fingers worried at her distinctive seed pearl ring and her too bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. Miss Marple had prepared the summer house with meticulous attention to detail, arranging Mrs. Fullerton's prized lily-of-the-valley flowers in a basket alongside lengths of pale blue silk ribbon and a silver thimble that caught the afternoon light. She began the proceedings with characteristic gentleness, speaking of Mrs. Fullerton's devotion to her flowers and her particular way of arranging them for church services. She had such precise methods, Miss Marple observed, watching carefully as Mrs. Ashworth volunteered to help with the memorial arrangement. One notices these little habits when one has lived as long as I have. The first test came when Miss Marple handed Mrs. Ashworth the blue silk ribbon, asking her to tie the flower stems with whatever knot seemed appropriate. Without conscious thought, Mrs. Ashworth's fingers formed the distinctive sailor's knot that Miss Marple had observed on the Grange napkins, the same precise technique that had left the silk thread found at the crime scene. The gesture was completed before thought could check instinct, revealing muscle memory that connected her directly to the physical evidence that Inspector Slack had dismissed as inconclusive. Miss Marple continued her gentle commentary, mentioning casually that she had been examining some of Mrs. Fullerton's pressed flower specimens and had discovered interesting traces of red clay that seemed foreign to local soil conditions. Mrs. Ashworth's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, and her carefully maintained composure showed the first signs of genuine strain as she recognized the significance of evidence she had thought safely buried with her victim. The conversation turned to family histories and the fascinating ways that past connections could surface unexpectedly in small communities, with Miss Marple mentioning her recent research into military records and the interesting connections she had discovered between current residents and historical events. She spoke with apparent innocence about Colonel Weatherby's brother, Marcus, and the young woman who had been present during the incident that claimed his life but had subsequently disappeared from all official records, watching as Mrs. Ashworth's performance of polite interest revealed knowledge far too detailed for someone whose connection to military matters was supposed to be purely through civilian marriage. The crucial moment arrived when Miss Marple produced what she described as a recently discovered photograph from Mrs. Fullerton's collection, an image showing military personnel at the base where Marcus Weatherby had died, with particular focus on a young woman whose distinctive seed pearl ring was clearly visible. Mrs. Ashworth's reaction was devastating in its involuntary honesty. She reached instinctively for her own ring, confirming the identification that Miss Marple had suspected throughout the investigation, while her face drained of color in recognition of evidence she had killed to suppress. Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed the psychological pressure that had driven Mrs. Ashworth to murder, explaining how Mrs. Fullerton had not merely discovered her true identity as Mercedes Wilton, but had uncovered evidence suggesting that Marcus Weatherby's death 30 years earlier had not been accidental. The methodical investigation had revealed a young woman involved in a relationship that violated military regulations, someone who had used her knowledge of medication and plant toxins to ensure permanent silence when exposure threatened her carefully constructed future. As the truth emerged through Miss Marple's relentless but understated pressure, Mrs. Ashworth's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated evidence and careful questioning. Her desperate attempts to maintain innocence became increasingly frantic as each piece of physical evidence was connected to her actions. The blue silk thread that matched her needlework, the intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fullerton's habits required to stage the murder, the red clay that connected her to both the original crime scene and the recent killing, and most damning of all, the carved letter "Im" in the summer-house floor that represented a signature she had been unable to resist leaving. The psychological dynamics of the confrontation revealed themselves as Mrs. Ashworth realized that her 30 years of successful deception, built on forged documents and fabricated histories, were crumbling before the patient observation of an elderly lady who understood that human nature, however carefully disguised, inevitably revealed itself through patterns of behavior that no amount of planning could entirely eliminate. Miss Marple had created the perfect conditions for truth to emerge, not through dramatic revelation, but through the inexorable pressure of evidence carefully presented to someone whose guilt made every innocent observation. The moment of truth arrived with the quiet inevitability that Miss Marple had learned to recognize in her long experience of human nature under pressure, as Mrs. Ashworth's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled beneath the weight of evidence that connected her not merely to Mrs. Fullerton's murder, but to a 30-year-old crime that had shaped every aspect of her subsequent life. The photograph that Miss Marple had produced, showing Mercedes Wilton standing beside Marcus Weatherby with her distinctive seed pearl ring clearly visible, created a silence in the summer house that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the present moment into decades of buried guilt and carefully constructed deception. Mrs. Ashworth's breakdown, when it came, was not the dramatic collapse that Inspector Slack might have expected, but rather the gradual dissolution of a performance that had been sustained for so long that it had almost become reality. Her hand moved instinctively to the seed pearl ring, that unconscious gesture confirming what Miss Marple had suspected throughout the investigation, while her face assumed the terrible blankness of someone whose entire adult identity was revealed as an elaborate lie. The woman who had been Vivian Ashworth for 30 years could no longer sustain the fiction that had governed her respectable existence in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's gentle but relentless explanation revealed the full scope of the deception that had begun 3 decades earlier at a military base characterized by its distinctive red clay soil. Mercedes Wilton had been involved in auxiliary medical services, providing her with both access to pharmaceutical supplies and knowledge of plant-based toxins that could be administered without detection. Her relationship with Marcus Weatherby had been complicated by his discovery of her involvement in black market activities, selling medical supplies to local civilians, and his threat to report her unless she agreed to marry him and provide respectability for both their careers. The murder of Marcus Weatherby had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that would later characterize Mrs. Fullerton's death, using lily-of-the-valley extract obtained from the base's ornamental gardens and administered in his evening tea with a precision that ensured death would appear natural to cursory military examination. Mercedes had staged the scene to suggest accidental poisoning, counting on wartime efficiency to conclude the investigation quickly rather than risk scandal that could damage institutional reputations. Her subsequent disappearance from official records had been facilitated by the chaos of military administration and her intimate knowledge of bureaucratic procedures. The years that followed had been devoted to creating the respectable life that Mercedes Wilton could never have achieved, building Vivian Ashworth through carefully forged documents and fabricated histories that would withstand casual scrutiny. Her marriage to Alistair Ashworth had provided the final element of respectability, transforming her from a suspected criminal into a pillar of village society whose word carried weight in local matters and whose past appeared beyond reproach. Mrs. Fullerton's investigation had begun innocently enough, while helping Colonel Weatherby organize family photographs for a memorial display, but her methodical nature and sharp eye had noticed inconsistencies in official accounts of Marcus's death. The discovery of hidden correspondence in church archives had provided additional evidence, including letters that Mercedes had written, revealing both her knowledge of plant toxins and her desperate need to escape the consequences of her criminal activities. Mrs. Fullerton's systematic research had created a comprehensive evidence file that Mercedes desperately needed to retrieve or destroy. The final confrontation had occurred in the pre-dawn hours of Easter morning, when Mercedes lured Mrs. Fullerton to the summer house under the pretense of discussing her threatened revelation. The lily-of-the-valley extract had been prepared using methods learned 30 years earlier, administered in tea that Mrs. Fullerton had accepted without suspicion from someone she considered a respectable neighbor. The elaborate staging of the crime scene had been designed to create multiple false narratives while destroying evidence of Mercedes's true identity, with the scattered flowers representing both a signature and a symbol of her intimate knowledge of the victim's horticultural passions. Timothy Ashford's involvement had been entirely innocent, his nervous behavior stemming from his romantic attachment to Mercedes and his unconscious recognition that something was desperately wrong with the woman he loved. His attempts to protect her had made him appear guilty to Inspector Slack's straightforward analysis, while Mercedes had been prepared to allow his conviction rather than risk her own exposure. The break-in at Mrs. Fullerton's cottage represented her final, desperate attempt to retrieve evidence that Miss Marple's patient investigation had already identified and preserved. As Inspector Slack arrived to make the necessary arrest, the assembled company watched in stunned silence as 30 years of successful deception crumbled in the face of evidence that connected past and present crimes through patterns of behavior that no amount of planning could entirely eliminate. Colonel Weatherby stood with military bearing intact, but profound sorrow evident in his expression, while Mrs. Pemberton wept quietly for her unwitting role in providing access and information that had facilitated the crime. Timothy Ashford looked on with a mixture of pity and horror, understanding finally the true nature of the woman he had so devotedly protected. The village of St. Mary Mead would recover from this Easter morning revelation with the resilient practicality that had sustained English communities through countless crises. But the knowledge that evil had lived among them in the guise of respectability would leave subtle changes in how neighbors regarded one another. Miss Marple, ever composed, reflected quietly on the terrible persistence of guilt and the way that human nature, however carefully disguised, inevitably revealed itself through the accumulated weight of small actions and unconscious gestures that patient observation could recognize and interpret. The woman who had killed twice to protect her carefully constructed identity had ultimately been undone by the same attention to detail that had enabled her crimes, proving once again that murder, however cleverly planned, carried within itself the seeds of its own discovery, like an accusation that could no longer be denied. The arrest of Mercedes Wilton sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that would reverberate long after Inspector Slack's official procedures were complete, transforming the village's Easter morning tragedy into a revelation that challenged every assumption about respectability and trust that had governed their small community for generations. The woman they had known as Vivian Ashworth was led away with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout her years of deception, though her carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled to reveal the calculating killer who had lived among them with such convincing normalcy that even Miss Marple's experienced eye had required careful observation to penetrate her elaborate disguise. Timothy Ashford's exoneration brought little comfort to the young man whose romantic devotion had nearly cost him his life, his pale features bearing the haunted expression of someone who had glimpsed the gallows through no fault of his own, while discovering that the woman he had sought to protect was capable of allowing his conviction rather than risk her own exposure. Colonel Weatherby, displaying the stoic grace that military training had instilled, offered Timothy continued employment and support, recognizing that the secretary had been as much a victim of Mercedes's manipulation as anyone else in their community. The revelation that his brother Marcus had been murdered rather than accidentally killed cast 30 years of accepted family history in an entirely different light, transforming grief into a more complex emotion that combined sorrow with the terrible knowledge that evil had touched his family twice through the same calculating hand. Mrs. Pemberton struggled with the knowledge that her unwitting assistance had facilitated both crimes, her meticulous household management having provided Mercedes with access to materials and information that had been essential to her deadly planning. The housekeeper's intimate knowledge of routines, her access to boot polish and silver thimbles, and her natural discretion had made her an ideal accomplice for someone who understood how to exploit trust and routine for murderous purposes. Her cryptic remarks about Ivy getting under tiles when nobody was looking now revealed themselves as unconscious recognition of secrets that had gradually worked their way into the foundation of village respectability, secrets that Mrs. Fullerton had discovered and paid for with her life. Mr. Alistair Ashworth faced perhaps the most devastating revelation of all, discovering that his marriage had been built entirely on lies, and that the woman he had loved was not merely a stranger, but a double murderer who had used him to complete her transformation from criminal fugitive to respected village matron. His genuine grief for what he had believed was a loving relationship was complicated by horror at his unwitting role in providing Mercedes with the final element of respectability she had needed to complete her 30-year deception. The legal implications of his innocent involvement would require careful handling, though his obvious shock and cooperation with authorities made clear his complete ignorance of his wife's true nature. The village itself struggled to absorb the implications of having harbored someone whose respectability had been so convincing that she had become a pillar of local society, while maintaining the capacity for cold-blooded murder when her carefully constructed world was threatened. Conversations at the post office and village green took on subdued tones as neighbors contemplated how thoroughly they had been deceived by someone whose every gesture and word had been calculated to maintain a false identity built on forged documents and fabricated histories that had withstood casual scrutiny for 3 decades. Miss Marple observed these reactions with the patient understanding that had served her well throughout the investigation, recognizing that the village's healing would require time and the gradual restoration of trust that had been so fundamentally shaken. She reflected on the psychological complexity of someone who had sustained such an elaborate deception for 30 years. Maintaining not merely a false identity, but an entirely fabricated personality that had convinced even those closest to her. The discipline required to suppress natural reactions and maintain consistent behavior patterns spoke to a criminal intelligence of unusual sophistication, while the willingness to kill twice rather than face exposure revealed a complete absence of moral constraint that had made Mercedes genuinely dangerous to anyone who threatened her carefully constructed world. The physical evidence that had seemed so puzzling throughout the investigation now revealed its significance with devastating clarity, each piece fitting into a pattern that spoke of meticulous planning and intimate knowledge of village life. The red clay, distinctive to the military base where Marcus Weatherby had died. The lily-of-the-valley flowers arranged with artistic precision around Mrs. Fullerton's body. The carved letter M in the summer house floor, and the mislabeled poison jar all represented elements of a sophisticated deception designed to create false narratives while destroying evidence of Mercedes's true identity. As the immediate crisis passed and village life began its gradual return to normalcy, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the enduring lessons about human nature revealed by this Easter morning tragedy. The capacity for evil to hide behind respectability, the persistence of guilt across decades, and the way that careful observation could reveal truth through the accumulation of small inconsistencies all reinforced her understanding that murder, however cleverly planned, ultimately contained within itself the evidence necessary for its own solution. The woman who had killed twice to protect her false identity had been undone by the same attention to detail that had enabled her crimes, proving once again that human nature, however carefully disguised, inevitably revealed itself through patterns of behavior that patient observation could recognize and interpret. The village would recover with the resilient practicality that had sustained English communities through countless crises. though the knowledge that evil had lived among them in the guise of respectability would leave subtle changes in how neighbors regarded one another, a wariness that would gradually fade but never entirely disappear from the collective memory of St. Mary Mead. The summer that followed Mercedes Wilton's arrest brought a gradual healing to St. Mary Mead, though the village would never quite return to its former innocence after discovering that 30 years of respectability had concealed such calculating evil. The church bells still rang each Sunday with their familiar bronze voices, calling the faithful to worship in the ancient sanctuary where Mrs. Fullerton's memory was honored with fresh flowers arranged by a rotating committee of village ladies who approached their task with reverent determination to maintain the standards their predecessor had established through years of devoted service. Timothy Ashford emerged from his ordeal, fundamentally changed, the nervous young man replaced by someone whose brush with the gallows had aged him into quiet maturity. Colonel Weatherby's continued support provided both employment and the structured environment that helped him rebuild his confidence, while the revelation of Mercedes's true nature allowed him to process his romantic attachment with the understanding that his devotion had been directed towards someone who had never truly existed except as an elaborate performance. He took to walking the village lanes in the evenings, no longer the stammering secretary, but a man who observed his surroundings with new awareness, perhaps unconsciously adopting Miss Marple's habit of noticing the small details that revealed larger truths about human nature. The colonel himself bore his brother's story with military stoicism, though the transformation of Marcus's supposed accident into confirmed murder reopened wounds that had scarred over during 30 years of accepted grief. He found himself re-examining every memory of his younger brother, searching for signs he had missed of the deception that had claimed a promising life. His support for Timothy became an act of quiet redemption, recognizing that the young man had been as much a victim of Mercedes' manipulation as anyone else in their community. Mrs. Pemberton struggled with the knowledge that her meticulous household management had unwittingly provided Mercedes with access to materials and information essential to her murderous planning. Her natural discretion and intimate knowledge of village routines had made her an ideal source of intelligence for someone who understood how to exploit trust and familiarity for deadly purposes. She attempted twice to resign her position, but the colonel refused both requests, understanding that guilt over innocent involvement could be as destructive as actual complicity. Her cryptic remarks about ivy getting under tiles when nobody was looking became local proverb, serving as both warning and comfort that some weaknesses protected houses while others destroyed them. Mr. Alistair Ashworth faced perhaps the most devastating aftermath of all, discovering that his marriage had been built entirely on lies, and that the woman he had loved was not merely a stranger, but a double murderer who had used him to complete her transformation from criminal fugitive to respected village matron. The legal proceedings that followed Mercedes' arrest revealed the full scope of her deception, with evidence showing how she had maintained false identities for 3 decades while building respectability on foundations of forged documents and fabricated histories. Unable to bear the weight of memories in every room of the Grange, Ashworth sold the property and departed for London, leaving behind a man profoundly altered by the discovery that one could be so thoroughly deceived by the person closest to them. The trial itself proceeded with the methodical efficiency that English justice demanded, Inspector Slack's evidence combining with Miss Marple's patient investigations and the physical clues that Mercedes had been unable to entirely eliminate. The red clay distinctive to the military base where Marcus Weatherby had died, the lily-of-the-valley flowers arranged with artistic precision, the carved letter in the summer-house floor and the mislabeled poison containers all told their portion of the story for anyone with knowledge and persistence to interpret their meaning correctly. Dr. Haydock, who had maintained professional composure throughout the crisis, became philosophical once the immediate danger passed, prescribing walks by the church herb border for those who worried in the small hours and observing that hearts failed for many reasons, most never written on certificates, Mrs. Bantry regained her appetite for other people's narratives, finding to her credit that she could tell this particular story without embroidery, perhaps because the facts were dramatic enough to require none. Miss Marple resumed her customary routines with characteristic composure, though she found herself observing neighbors with perhaps slightly sharper attention than before, recognizing that the capacity for sustained deception existed in forms far more sophisticated than most people were prepared to acknowledge. She reflected often on the psychological complexity revealed by Mercedes's 30-year performance, marveling at the discipline required to suppress natural reactions while harboring knowledge of 2 murders and the constant fear of exposure that must have accompanied every social interaction. As autumn approached and the immediate crisis faded into memory, Miss Marple took her tea by the open window, where robins fussed along the garden wall and the scent of damp earth rose after evening showers. She understood that the village would endure, as English villages had survived countless trials throughout their long histories, though the knowledge that respectability could mask such calculated evil would remain part of their collective understanding. The woman who had killed twice to protect her false identity had ultimately been undone by the same attention to detail that had enabled her crimes, proving once again that murder, however cleverly planned, carried within itself the seeds of its own discovery for anyone with the wisdom to recognize the signs and the courage to pursue truth wherever it might lead.